Shabbat shalom, my friends, and welcome back to our Torah conversations. Okay, what comes next ought to be simple, but in fact, it isn't so very simple. Should I now also wish everyone a Chag Samayach? The answer is a firm and confident yes and no. If you are living in Israel, Saturday, April 23rd is no longer a festival day. Passover is a 7-day event. Friday was the 7th day, so no Chag Samayach for you. But if you are an Orthodox Jew living outside of Israel, April 23rd is the 8th and final day of the Chag. So you get Chag Samayach. And if you are a conservative Jew living outside of Israel, the answer is pretty much the same. So once again, you get Chag Samayach. But if you are a Reformed Jew living outside of Israel, Friday was the 7th and final day of Pesach. No Chag Samayach for you. This somewhat reminds me of a phenomenon that was not unusual in the business world a few years ago, when working hours were staggered so that not everybody would pour out onto the highways at the very same time on the way home. So are we staggering the end of Pesach so that not every Jew orders the post-Pesach chometz-rich pizza at the same time? I would say probably not. Oh, one more thing. If you are an Oleh, one who made Aliyah and who are now living in Israel, you probably observed 8 days in your land of origin. Therefore, living in Israel, it is appropriate for such individuals to continue to observe 8 days Pesach while living in Israel. Now, this stuff is interesting and important to individuals, but when the so-called 8th day of Passover occurs on a Shabbat, then the usual Torah reading is set aside, and there are special Torah and Haftarah readings in its place. And so now we're getting to a communal problem. The universally solid and consistent unified pattern of Torah readings is now being temporarily interrupted. So, if you side with those who hold that this Shabbat is the 8th day, then you will read Deuteronomy 14:22 to 16:17 and Numbers 28:19 to 25. Remember that. But if you side with those who hold that this Shabbat is no longer Pesach, then you will read the Sedra known as Acharei Mot, Leviticus 16:1 to 18:30. Okay, so what are we going to do? We're going to treat Saturday, April 23rd as the 8th day of Pesach, which happens to fit with my personal practice. Saturday night will be pizza night in our home right after Havdalah. The Deuteronomy passage for the 8th day of Pesach was selected by the rabbis primarily because it contains, among several other matters, instructions regarding the observance of the 3 pilgrimage festivals: the Festival of Weeks, or Shavuot, the Festival of Booths, Sukkot, and the Festival of Pesach. But if we allow our eyes to shift away just a little bit from the Passover material, we might very well notice some other verses in what we have been assigned to read that are incredibly important. Deuteronomy 15:4 states, "There shall be no needy among you." But Deuteronomy 15:7, 3 verses later, states, "If, however, there is a needy person among you, do not harden your heart," and so forth. These 2 verses seem to be a world apart. What's it going to be? There shall be no needy among you, or if there is, however, a needy person, then. If this isn't a direct internal contradiction, then at the very least we can feel the tension between the two passages. You will be going into the promised land. God will bless the Israelites precisely and exactly as God had already promised. An economically solid Israel will be the financial kingpin of the world, and Israel will dominate some other nations. In such an environment, there will be no needy among us. But you go over to verse 7, you don't see such happy times. Some among the people of Israel will indeed be wealthy landowners, but others will be living in poverty. That equation is unchangeable. It is the way of the world. Therefore, it is your obligation to give and give again to alleviate the suffering of others. Two very different verses. So what do we have? Then we move to verse 11. Our reading ends with the following. For there will never cease to be needy ones in your land, so open your hand to the poor and the needy. There will never cease to be needy ones. The Torah isn't playing with us here. In fact, I would hold that these 3 verses lay out the entire mission of what we have come to call Tikkun Olam. Just think about it right here. The divine intention is that this world not be a place of human suffering. That's what God intends. This perspective is a powerful theme throughout the entire book of Deuteronomy. Shai Held insists that it is a core message of Deuteronomy that access to the blessing of God be available to all the members of the community. I walk the Venice Boardwalk almost every day. The Unhoused are a significant presence there. I've mentioned them before, with many dozens of their tents scattered on the beach, with their shopping carts filled with whatever they call their most important possessions, never beyond their reach, and with doorways, hallways, and park benches providing none of the comforts of home. Intense poverty, serious drug and alcohol addiction, with mental illness on full public display, shouts and screams, and unfortunately, not unexpectedly, with some acts of physical violence as well. Our text states, "There shall be no needy among you." That's a vision of divine intention, but a vision desperately far from our own reality. Then, if, however, there is a needy person among you, you are forbidden to harden your hearts and shut your hands. If you fail to act, then every cry of every suffering person will rise up to the throne of God and testify against you. That's what Jewish tradition teaches. The juxtaposition of these verses makes it very clear that the author did not expect human suffering to disappear because of whatever it is that we as individuals do. We are told that we cannot take shelter behind the way our society is structured. That's just the way it is, you know. Rather, change those structures. Create systems of compassion as replacements for bureaucratic incapacity. Bottom line, we are forbidden to harden our hearts and to shut our hands. And the third verse, remember, you will never solve the problem of human suffering. Solving that problem, my friends, is not in the cards. So patoach tiftach, open your hands again and again and again. We are forbidden to give up in frustration, forbidden to give up in despair. We acknowledge God's vision, as stated here, will never be fully realized. But embracing now the most powerful Passover metaphor, We must do our best to keep the door open, because Elijah can only enter our world through the doors we open. Elijah opened doors, we open the doors. Shabbat shalom. Chag Samayach, as appropriate. See you next week.